Last night, under the chandeliers of the Mansion House, Chancellor Rachel Reeves stood at the podium and delivered a speech that sent shockwaves through the heart of the British financial world. With barely concealed contempt for the post-2008 crash regulations, she declared war on the red tape that she says has held the UK economy hostage for too long. Her words seem to echo a growing, daring ambition in the government to pivot Britain's role on the world stage, one that might just reignite its place as a leading financial powerhouse, or, perhaps, drive it into economic chaos. But Reeves's speech wasn't the only bombshell of the evening. In a moment, charged with both subtlety and sharpness, Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey took the opportunity to lay down his own warning, a warning about the true cost of Brexit and Britain's tangled economic future if relations with the EU aren't mended. The evening turned into a battle of ideologies, sparking tensions, sending shivers down spines, and setting Britain on a potential collision course with its recent past. But that was only the beginning. Let's dive into the latest bombshell details from the last 24 hours. This wasn't just a matter of policy adjustments. This was the Chancellor throwing down the gauntlet, positioning the government against the financial safeguards built after one of the UK's darkest economic hours. And as if to underscore the urgency of it all, Bank Governor Bailey chimed in with a reminder. Brexit, he said, had consequences that Britain wasn't reckoning with nearly enough. So, hit that like button, subscribe, and buckle up, because this story is about to get explosive. Under the glittering ceilings of Mansion House, a storm was brewing. Chancellor Rachel Reeves, only months into her position, stood in front of some of Britain's most powerful financial elites, ready to turn the government's financial policy on its head. She declared in stark terms that the UK had gone too far in the decade since the 2008 financial crash, suffocating its own growth potential by bogging down the financial sector with layer upon layer of restrictive regulations. These rules, which were intended to prevent another crash, she claimed, had trapped the economy in a relentless cycle of caution and overregulation. In what was arguably one of her boldest moves yet, she announced plans to cut through the red tape, promising a growth-focused, regulatory approach that would transform how the financial sector operated, potentially reintroducing the very risks Britain had worked to mitigate for years. What made her comments even more shocking was their timing and location. The Mansion House, a centuries-old institution associated with wealth, power, and, perhaps above all, caution. Reeves's suggestion that the UK was regulating for risk, but not for growth, struck a nerve in the crowd. For many, it seemed the Chancellor was suggesting that Britain had learned too well from the 2008 crisis and that the pendulum of caution had swung too far. It was a provocative, divisive stance that pitted her directly against the very regulatory framework that had held back risk but, as she claimed, had stifled economic opportunity. Her rhetoric was bold, but Reeves wasn't just speaking to the elites in the room. Her real audience was the international financial community, and her message was clear. Britain was open for business, risk be damned. But even as she attempted to signal strength and confidence, a shadow loomed over the evening. Governor Andrew Bailey stepped up to the podium, and in his calm but firm voice, he began to cast doubt on Reeves's vision. His words may have lacked the fire of a political rally, but his warnings about Brexit's lasting damage to the UK economy resonated deeply. Bailey didn't mince words. Brexit, he said, had consequences, and the government's attempts to ignore them were futile at best and damaging at worst. In a subtle but pointed rebuke, he reminded the audience of the economic cost of Brexit that no amount of deregulation could erase. But Bailey went further. He hinted that Britain's GDP, a key measure of economic success, was in desperate need of recalibration. With the new data collection methods soon to be adopted by the Office for National Statistics, he suggested that the economy might actually be larger than current measurements indicated, by perhaps even a few percentage points. This raised an eyebrow in the room. Could it be that Britain's economy was being underestimated due to outdated methods, even as the country scrambled to justify the post-Brexit slump? Bailey's cautionary approach emphasised that while deregulation might spur growth, it wouldn't negate the structural weaknesses Brexit had exposed. Then, almost as if it were an aside, Bailey brought up what he called a substantial problem: the UK's labour data. I do struggle to explain when my fellow central bank governors ask me why the British are particularly bad at this, he said. with a tone that hovered between frustration and incredulity. Britain, he explained, was plagued by unreliable labour statistics, with fewer people answering ONS surveys, a development that had left the Bank of England and Treasury grappling in the dark about the real state of the workforce. The irony was not lost on the crowd. Here was a government pledging to ramp up growth while facing a knowledge gap so vast it couldn't accurately assess the availability or productivity of its own workers. Meanwhile, as these high-level debates unfolded, in another part of the city, Conservative MPs, Reform UK voices, and community leaders were battling over issues of immigration and benefits dependency. Reform MP Lee Anderson had taken to the airwaves, making headlines with incendiary claims about migrants taking from the British welfare system. His language was divisive, casting doubt on the value of migrants in the UK and framing them as a drain on resources. Anderson's remarks echoed a deepening frustration among certain factions that the government's immigration policies had created a dependency culture rather than a workforce. The DWP quickly dismissed his statements, labelling them a misrepresentation, yet the public debate raged on, fueled by calls for a radical overhaul of how the welfare system interacts with immigration policy. Adding to the climate of contention, MPs across the UK were fuming about the proposed closures of over 100 post office branches, a move set to sever crucial lifelines in some of the UK's most underserved communities. For many MPs, the closures were an assault on the very fabric of small-town Britain, where post offices often provide the only access to essential services. As community campaigns kicked off to protest the closures, the debate over public spending versus private efficiency reared its head yet again, highlighting the increasing tension between local needs and national policies. At the same time, the government's push for green innovation reached a new milestone with the announcement of a massive investment deal in Grangemouth. The region, with its industrial heritage and strategic location, was set to receive £148 million in funding to create thousands of green jobs and reinvent itself as a hub of eco-friendly innovation. But the optimism was undercut by the looming closure of the 100-year-old Grangemouth distillery, a decision that symbolised the challenges of balancing legacy industries with the march towards sustainability. The announcement laid bare the delicate juggling act that politicians face, investing in the future while managing the fallout from the past. The evening at Mansion House underscored the extent of Britain's identity crisis. On one hand, leaders were making a case for a bold, risk-taking and independent UK economy. On the other, they were grappling with the constraints and divisions left in Brexit's wake, dealing with data deficits, community outcry, and the difficult path to a greener future. As Rachel Reeves left the Mansion House that night, she might have reflected on the fact that dismantling the status quo is easier declared than done, and that the real test of her vision had only just begun.